Right, so good afternoon again. And we're just about having our guests with us in the next 2 or 3 minutes. Apologies for the less. Okay, so I think our guests are here. And again, apologies for the late start. Okay, so let's warmly. Okay. All right. So before we start, before we have our guests here, I'd just like to say that we'll try and make up for the time as much as we can. We'll have a brief welcome by the ASG Vice President for Academic Affairs, Professor Mani El Sharif. And then we'll have our remarks by our guest of honor. And then we'll also have a fireside chat with Dr. Mutebi. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers, and we'll have our closing remarks. So we'll keep it very brief. My advice is that if you have a question, keep it brief. It will be one question per person, not 1, 2, 3, but just one, so that we can also make up for some time. Thanks again. I'd like to call Prof. Amani to give her welcome remarks.
Hi everyone. Sorry for the delay. Dear students and guests, our faculty members and staff, it's my esteemed pleasure to welcome you all to the African School of Governance and its inaugural policy talk. The African School of Governance is born from a simple but urgent necessity. Africa's potential is its youth, its vast resources, and its resilient spirit. This urgent necessity was behind establishing ASG, where exceptional leaders' visions meet to create the continent's premier hub for thought leaders, practice, and innovation. We are here to cultivate leaders who are not only brilliant, but also ethical leaders and actors. Our guest speakers today Professor Kishore Mahbubani embodies the ASG vision. More importantly, we are grateful for him for agreeing to visit ASG as we start our journey towards building a truly Pan-African school driven by excellence and ethical governance. Dear esteemed guests, faculty, and students, I'm grateful that you all are here today with us, and I am confident you will learn a lot from today's session. I'm sure it will be a masterclass. I invite all of you to be part of the family of ASG, and I'm looking forward for your interaction and engagement with ASG in all our activities. And now I would like to invite the board member, Mr. Francis Gattari, to introduce our guest of honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Amani. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at ASG, and most importantly, it's an honor to be here to introduce a distinguished diplomat, a senior public servant of the government of Singapore, a good friend of Rwanda, a friend of His Excellency President Paul Kagame, and our guest here today. Professor Kishore Mahbubani is very well known. His profile requires no introduction because it's everywhere online. But let me say this, that because of his distinguished diplomatic career in his country, first as the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as permanent representative of the government of Singapore to the United Nations in New York, 2 times president of the UN National Security Council, and most importantly, perhaps, he's here because of his role as the first dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. It is because of Professor Kishore Mahbubani and his contribution to establishing the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy that we are here today as ASG, because you see, we were inspired by what the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy has done by establishing a truly Asian School of Public Policy, learning and taking lessons from some of the international best practices in schools of public policy and transforming them into one that serves a regional perspective. It was because of that the vision for the African School of Governance was born, to truly create a Pan-African School of Public Policy and governance that will look at the world of public policy from an African perspective, that will look at solutions for African problems with a perspective of African solutions, that will empower African leaders to confront problems of their communities, the nations, and our continent from a competitive and a competent point of view. And so we welcome Professor Kishore Mahbubani as our speaker today, but more importantly, we welcome you here, sir, and recognize the contribution you have made in shaping what ASG is today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kishore Mahbubani to the podium. Welcome.
Thank you, Francis, for that very warm and generous introduction and the very warm welcome you gave me. And I'm very happy to be here because coming here in the early days of the African School of Governance reminds me of what I experienced when I was the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, we also started small, like you, with a small group of faculty, but we grew rapidly, and as you said, we're happy to be recognized as one of Asia's leading schools of public policy. And I'm very confident that the African School of Governance will succeed as well as the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy has, given the commitment and the dedication of all the faculty and the leaders of the African School of Governance. And at the same time, I'm also happy to be here to share with you the larger story of Singapore too, because the topic assigned to me was about how strong leaders can make a difference. And actually, if there's one country that has really benefited from strong leadership, it's Singapore. So what I want to try and do is to share with you the story of Singapore, because what's remarkable is how few people know how remarkable the story of Singapore is. Because if you take Singapore, I mean, nowadays, whenever people mention Singapore, everyone thinks it's this modern, gleaming, successful state that, has always been successful. But I can assure you that when I grew up, Singapore was really a typical third world developing country. When we became independent in 1965, I think our per capita income, if I remember correctly, was the same as, I think, Ghana in Africa, about $500 a month. And Singapore suffered all the traditional problems of developing country. I was put on a special feeding program because I was technically undernourished as a child. Now you can see I'm overnourished. But I grew up in a house without a flush toilet for the first 13 years of my life. There were gangsters fighting each other with opium beer bottles a few yards from my house where I was sitting. So it was a very different Singapore. And what's remarkable is that Singapore, with a per capita income of $500, now has a per capita income of $90,000, which is, by the way, much higher than that of the British who once colonized us, and also, by the way, higher than that of the United States of America. Now, I can tell you one thing. No other country has done this. It's an amazing feat of history to do all this in one lifetime, one human lifetime. And I'm surprised that there isn't greater curiosity about the Singapore story. I mean, just imagine it. Look at any country in the world today with $500, imagining it within one lifetime becoming 90,000. Very difficult, right? So it's a remarkable story. So I hope in the 20 minutes you assigned to me, I'll explain to you the Singapore story in 3 parts. In part 1, I'm going to talk about the 3 key individuals who played the most important role in Singapore's success and development. As you know, most people associate the Singapore success story with one man, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and he was remarkable. I mean, he's absolutely remarkable human being. But it wasn't a one-man success story. There were many others, but at least 2 other critical individuals. The economic architect of Singapore's economic miracle was a man called Dr. Goh Keng Swee. He had a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics. And then the foreign minister, Mr. S. Rajaratnam, who had been a journalist and a master communicator. And, as someone who I've had the blessings of having a very rich life, traveled around the world, met many world leaders. And I met many world leaders of impressive countries, right? You know, in the US, Europe, and all that. But looking back, I can say with great confidence that many of the European leaders I met were not up to the level of Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, or Rajaratnam. They were off the charts in many ways. Incidentally, today I can only give you a very brief glimpse into this man, but I wanted to just show you I came out in my memoirs recently called Living the Asian Century. So if you want to get a little bit more about how poor Singapore was and how Singapore traveled the journey and my encounters with Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam, you get more details if you want in these memoirs of mine, Living the Asian Century. So part one, I'll talk about them. Part two, I'll talk about the principles, some of the key policies and principles that guided Singapore's success, because they, as I'll explain, can be replicable anywhere. And then I'll talk a little bit also, because I know this is of interest in any school of public policy, about the leadership characteristics of these three great men that I mentioned, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Rajaratnam. So let me begin first by talking about these three men. And these three individuals, by the way, if I had to ask myself, why did it turn out the way they did? One, there are many ways of answering motivations of people, right? But one critical thing is that they all face common challenges as they grew up. They were all born in the in the second or third decade of the 20th century, in the 1910s, 1920s. And as they grew up in a British colony of Singapore, and they became anti-colonial. They had to struggle against the British colonial rule. And then Singapore was invaded and occupied by the Japanese for 3 years in 1942 to 1945. And British colonial rule was bad. Japanese colonial rule was much worse. I mean, there were massacres of people that took place during Japanese colonial rule. And for all three of them, when you go through a painful, brutal occupation, it transforms you, it makes you stronger. And the iron in their spine came out in that struggle. And of course, but even after British colonial rule ended, Singapore had 2 difficult years being part of Malaysia. There were struggles with the Malaysian government. This is all documented. And also, by the way, struggles against pro-communist forces in Singapore. So these three men literally went through life and death struggles. And I have to emphasize that, because unless you go through life and death struggles, you don't get the kind of fire in your belly, the motivation to struggle against great odds. And this is what these three men developed, fire in their belly when they had to deal with life-threatening challenges that they encountered in the British colonial rule, Japanese occupation, struggles in Malaysia, and in the struggle against the communist forces. But amazingly, as a result of all these struggles, Singapore became independent in 1965. And I can tell you, when most countries become independent, they celebrate, they have fireworks, and they say, oh, wonderful, we are liberated, we are free, we can do what we want to do. I can, till today, because I was 17 years old then, still remember the mood in the streets of Singapore as I walk around, as they announced that Singapore has separated from Malaysia. Nobody was celebrating. Some people were crying. Even Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore cried on Independence Day, because everyone thought that if you take a city like Singapore, rip it out of its hinterland, Malaysia, and throw it out, that city will crumble and fall. You'll be a city without a hinterland. So Singapore, when it was born, was destined to fail. And so that's what makes Singapore so remarkable. At birth, it was supposed to fail, not to emerge as a real superstar. But that's what happened. But because the leaders knew that Singapore was going to fail unless they did some remarkable things, that's what motivated them to really succeed in this struggle. And quite amazingly, there was a formidable combination of skills between these three gentlemen. So Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who was trained as a lawyer in the UK, and of course, all three were intellectually brilliant, had an amazing capacity to communicate very well. And communication is so important because when you want to take people out of difficult circumstances and tell them we have to make some sacrifices if we go ahead, you require a master communicator. And if you have any doubt, just go and Google and download any speech of Lee Kuan Yew, and you will see what a remarkable, amazing individual he was in his capacity to, communicate to the people and carry the people along. So if Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had been standing here, talking to you, all of you would have been paying incredibly careful attention to him. By contrast, if the second gentleman I mentioned, if Dr. Goh Keng Swee was talking to you today in this room, I guarantee you after 15 minutes, all of you will be sleeping. Because he never knew how to deliver a speech. And he wrote brilliant speeches. You must go back and read his speeches, but never listen to them. Because he just didn't have the ability to deliver a speech, and he would just put his glasses on and stand here and then read everything he had written. Everything was brilliant, but unless you deliver it well, people don't get the message and they fell asleep. But Dr. Goh was absolutely amazing, in his insights. And in some ways, there's many miracles about Singapore. Per capita income is one of them. The other miracle of Singapore is that we have no land, no territory. We are so small as a country, If you want to know how small Singapore is, there's another island in Southeast Asia called Sumatra. It's in Indonesia, big island. Now on that island, there's a volcano. And then if you go up to the top of the volcano, there's a lake. In the middle of the lake, there's a small island. That island is bigger than Singapore. Okay, now you know how small Singapore is, right? And this island with nothing, with no resources, today has one of the highest amount of foreign reserves of any country in the world. No oil, nothing, no gas. But that's Dr. Goh Keng Swee. Because he was so tough and so frugal as a finance minister. He wouldn't waste not a penny. He inculcated a habit of savings. And he was personally very frugal. I can tell you, when as finance minister of Singapore, he would travel, stay in a nice hotel. But at night, after finishing all his work, while everybody was having a good time, he went back to his bedroom, went to the sink, washed his underwear himself, and hung it up. That's frugality. And that frugality was plunged into the DNA of Singapore. And that's how we end up with one of the world's highest reserves of any country in the world. Because of the frugality of one man, Dr. Goh. And Rajaratnam was like Lee Kuan Yew, a brilliant communicator. He wrote well, he spoke well, and he was a master in his analysis of what was happening geopolitically. By the way, so were Lee Kuan Yew, so were Goh Keng Swee. And so this combination of these three men, their skills complemented each other so well. And so it was this amazing combination of people. So whatever challenge came along to Singapore, they were able to deal with it and always found ingenious ways and means of dealing with it. So what were the policies that were used, critical policies of Singapore that enabled Singapore to succeed? And this will be part 2 of my remarks. And here, when I was dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, I would give a lecture to all the students of the Lee Kuan Yew schools. I said, before you leave Singapore, I must give you the secret of Singapore's success. So I gave it to them free of charge. It's a very simple formula. It's easy to remember. It's MPH. MPH doesn't stand for miles per hour, by the way, which is what the British associated with. M is for meritocracy. And meritocracy is you can find many sophisticated explanations for it, but the simplest explanation for it is, and this is how I describe it, okay? You take another country, you want to understand meritocracy and the impact. Look at another country which, unlike Singapore, was born with the most promising circumstances ever in the third world. In fact, in the year 1900, it was one of the top 10 richest countries in the world. The name of the country is Argentina. Now, Argentina and Singapore both practice meritocracy, but in different areas. Now, I can tell you, when Argentina had to select its football team, it didn't care what class you came from, how rich you were, how poor you were. They made sure that the best footballers joined the Argentinian national team, right? And that's why Argentina is a football superpower, right? But when it came to economics, for some reason, Argentinians didn't choose the best. They picked up, my cousin, my uncle, my nephew, my niece suddenly become the finance minister or something like that, right? So they practiced meritocracy in football. They succeeded becoming a football superpower. Economics, Argentina is the one country that has been in reverse gear for 100 years. I'm not exaggerating, by the way. Singapore, by the way, has the worst football team in the world. I shouldn't say that, but it's just true. I mean, we're lucky if we qualify for any soccer competition. But unlike Argentina, we have the best economics team in the world. So when it comes to selecting our economics team, they are better than any team anywhere in the world. Right? That's meritocracy. See? The Argentinians applied it to football, it worked. We applied it to economics, and it worked. And that, it's funny, it's not a difficult thing to do for countries. But I can tell you, most countries, when they select their economics team, don't do it. That's a fact. And so that's one simple thing that Singapore did. And by the way, we applied our meritocracy across all sectors of the society, not just in economics. In social work, in politics, in education, in healthcare, every field of endeavor, we pick the best people always, and that was meritocracy. And then the second P stands for pragmatism. And pragmatism means quite simply that if we encounter a problem, Singapore encounters a problem, the first thing Dr. Goh Keng Swee would say, he said this to me, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, he said, Kishore, if we encounter a problem, we are never the first country to encounter that problem. Somebody somewhere has encountered that same problem, right? And why don't we go and study what they did with it? And so we copy them, right? And the reason why Dr. Goh created the most successful economy of the 20th century was because he asked himself a simple question: which was the first Asian country to succeed in economic development? Answer is obvious. It's Japan. Japan industrialized way back in the 1860s. So he said, okay, let's go learn from Japan. So I mentioned earlier that the Japanese had a brutal occupation of Singapore. But when Dr. Goh saw that Japan had been the first country to succeed, forget the brutal occupation. We learn. We go to Japan. We study the Meiji Restoration. And it's amazing how thoroughly he studied it. Amazing. And so this is what we did. Singapore basically succeeded by becoming the first copycat nation in the world. And copying is so easy, right? I don't understand why more countries don't do it. But fortunately, that Singapore gene is traveling. Just on the drive here, as I was driving here, looking at my Twitter account, I just saw a tweet. Now, one famous American today is the son-in-law of Donald Trump. His name is Jared Kushner. And Jared Kushner just said that when I first joined government and I encountered any problem in government, I would tell my staff, okay, first tell me what Singapore did with that problem. The fact that the son-in-law of Donald Trump realizes that to succeed, you got to copy Singapore shows you how far Singapore has come. And there are others like that, by the way. There was a man who was a key political advisor to Boris Johnson. His name is Dominic Cummings. He also would tell his staff, tell me what Singapore did on that subject. See? So we succeeded by becoming a copycat country. Our challenge, of course, became, when we became so successful, we couldn't copy other countries because there wasn't anyone in front of us to copy. And this, I can tell you a simple true story. We have one of the best ports in the world, really, no question. The best functioning ports in the world. How did we succeed? We copied Rotterdam, right? Netherlands. So I accompanied our Prime Minister, Mr. Goh Chok Tong, 30 years ago, in 1995. And when the Prime Minister of Singapore arrived at the Port of Rotterdam, the CEO of the Port of Rotterdam came to the podium like this to welcome the Prime Minister of Singapore. He said, Prime Minister, welcome to Rotterdam. He said, but I'm very embarrassed. I shouldn't be briefing you. You should be briefing me. The Port of Singapore today is much better than the Port of Rotterdam. Incredible. We learn from Rotterdam. And the CEO says, you're way ahead of us now. See, that's an example of how you learn and you move forward. And that's what pragmatism is. I hope I'm responsible for the rain. Huh? I believe rain is a good sign of good luck, right? Yes, it's good to hear the rain. The last H, I can tell you, I must emphasize to you, M is easy to copy, P is easy to copy, H is very, very hard. And I'll say something incredibly outrageous. Most countries fail because of the H factor. So, what is H? H stands for honesty. And I can tell you, I mentioned to you how remarkable Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Rajaratnam were. But the truly remarkable thing about them is that they were completely honest. 3 of them surely could have found ways and means of at least getting some of the rewards for themselves. 0. Not 1 penny was ever taken from the government coffers. And not only that, they set very high standards for everybody. And I can tell you, within a few years of Singapore's independence in 1965, when one of the government ministers went overseas on vacation. He went overseas because a businessman friend of his said, come along with me on vacation. He told a businessman friend, I have no money. In those days, Singapore salaries were very low. So the businessman said, don't worry, I'm your friend, I'll pay for everything. So the businessman paid for everything, didn't ask for anything in return, just treated his friend. But when the minister came back, and when Mr. Lee Kuan Yew found out that he had gone on a free vacation, which was against the rules, boom, he went to jail. That's it. So when a top minister goes to jail for just accepting a gift, everybody gets the message. And that's it. And that you end up with everyone realizing that you can't get away with it. And I can tell you that there's so many countries in this world with tremendous natural resources. The countries should be far richer than Singapore. But as you know, the money ends up in private accounts and not in public accounts. And all the money of Singapore just sits in public accounts. There are no private accounts. And that's the hardest part of Singapore's success. Now, very quickly, let me quickly end by talking about the leadership characteristics of these three men. And actually, I did come out with the other thing I used to do at Lee Kuan Yew School was everybody would ask me, every student at Lee Kuan Yew School, so how do people become great leaders? What's the secret? So I came up with my theory of 5 C's. I chose 5 C's because Singaporeans, when in the early days of Singapore, when Singapore was developing, the people were aspiring for a middle class. And so the 5 C's of success in Singapore, I can't remember all of them. It was cash, car, credit card, country club. I forget what the 5th C is. Anyway, but those are the 5 C's, okay? But the 5 C's of leadership are much harder. And I hope I can remember all of them. If I can't remember them, you can Google and get them in an article I wrote for Project Syndicate, together with Klaus Schwab, the founder of World Economic Forum. So the first C is the most important C, is compassion. Now this is one thing I can tell you about Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam. They were absolutely committed to eradicating poverty from Singapore. They want to see, and I can tell you, Dr. Goh wrote a book when he was doing his PhD about how sometimes families of 20 people would live in one room in Singapore. 20 people living in one room, and then there'll be one toilet with people, with 40, 50 people, one toilet, all living in 3 rooms. That's the kind of extreme poverty Singapore had when we started off. And they wanted to eradicate that. And the compassion that they had for the people is enormous. And that's why you find, by the way, because they saw that extreme poverty, the net result of it all is that Singapore today has the best public housing program in the world. About 80% of the population live in public housing, but they don't live in rented public housing. They live in public housing that they own, that appreciates in value and gives them a very comfortable lifestyle. I have 2 sisters living in Singapore. Both my sisters live in public housing, comfortable public housing in Singapore. So that's an example that compassion is very critical. Now the second C I've already sort of mentioned already in some ways. It's collector of talent. That's meritocracy. And I can tell you the quality of mind of people who will be working with Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee and Rajaratnam were amazing. And that's collector of talent. And the third C is I call complexity, the ability to master complexity, which means that you must have a very high IQ, extremely high IQ. And this is where, frankly, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee and Rajaratnam were just amazing. I mean, their IQ, their capacity to master complex issues and to and figure out ways and means of dealing with them, that was amazing. And the fourth C is something that I'm sure you've all thought about. It's courage. Because they fought against all odds, right? When they had to deal with the Japanese, when they had to deal with the communists and so on and so forth. So clearly having a lot of courage was very, very critical for them. So the first four C's are not surprising, but the fifth C may be a bit of a surprise to you, because it is actually very rare among good people in the world. And the fifth C is cunning. Cunning. And I can tell you, as someone who has now observed politics for only 55 years, that the most successful politicians are the cunning politicians. But of course, to succeed as a cunning politician, the first rule is that you must deny that you're cunning. You must pretend you're not cunning. You must pretend that you're so straightforward and an honest gentleman. But that's the challenge. And I can tell you, for reasons, I'm going to conclude with this, for reasons that I don't understand, we all want good people to run the world. We want all good people to run our societies. But unfortunately, most good people, because they are so good, they're not cunning. And so they lose out in politics to people who are far more cunning than they are. And see, in politics, unlike economics, it's a zero-sum game. In economics, two countries can grow, two countries can succeed, right? Very clear, right? Similarly, in economics, two companies can succeed, two companies can grow. But in politics, it's a zero-sum game. Either you are president or I'm president. And if I'm president, I have all the power. You have nothing. So that's why you've got to be very, very cunning in politics. And I can tell you that these incredibly honest, good individuals, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Rajaratnam, were incredibly shrewd and cunning. And that's why Singapore has been an absolute superstar in development in the last 70 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Kishore Mabubani. This has been so good, so much to learn. I have just 3 words: learn, move forward. Learn, move forward. Thank you so much for sharing so much about others with us. You're so generous. But now it's time to share a lot more about yourself with us, because you're a giant in many ways. And so to do that, I'd like to call Dr. Guluba Mutebi. He is a very esteemed political analyst and a writer. He wears many, many hats. I'd like him to come and share the platform with Prof. Kishore, and then they will talk about other things that he missed. He has been very generous with talking about others, but we want him to share a lot more about his life, how he got where he is, and how many more nuggets he has in himself to share with us. Thank you.
Yeah, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege for me to be sitting here with Professor Mabubani. I've just told him that I have met him many times on YouTube. It's very good to meet him in person. And thank you, Professor Feni, for moderating this event. Professor Feni said we are going to be talking about Professor Mabubani as a person. I'm sure that will be very interesting. But I would like to believe that in the audience, given we have a lot of students here of public policy, given we have lots of Africans here, the things that Professor Mabubani was talking about, describing to us how Singapore succeeded, I think we need to get to know a little bit more about how Singapore did it. And then perhaps later on we will focus a little bit on Professor Mabubani himself. Professor, I wanted to ask a question about something that you didn't mention, but which is critical, I think, in terms of thinking about how countries succeed or how countries can succeed. How much success do you say Singapore would have achieved if it had been a conventional multi-party polity?
Yeah, great question. Because one of the, as you know, when you read, especially the Anglo-Saxon media, when they write about Singapore, they will say Singapore has succeeded, but it's all because of a dictator called Lee Kuan Yew, right? I mean, they say this, and I can tell you that when I was in the World Economic Forum once, I was explaining to a group of Argentinian businessmen how Singapore has succeeded, and the Argentinian businessman said, well, you know, if Singapore is so successful, why do you have, and he was struggling to find the right words in English. In English, his question was, why does Singapore have an illuminated despotism, which means enlightened dictatorship? So my answer to him was, if it was just purely a result of a dictator, then it would suggest that dictators are the answer to the problem. But as you can see, most countries with dictators fail. It's a fact. I mean, statistically speaking, most countries that have strong dictators fail. Very rarely do you have strong leaders that succeed. And the thing about Singapore is that even though it doesn't have a Western-style multi-party system, the real secret of Singapore is that every 5 years we have elections without fail. And this, I guarantee you this, the ballot boxes are not stuffed in Singapore. The results reflect the real wishes of the people. And the result, so as you know, election after election, the governing party, the People's Action Party, has been winning. Now, it doesn't get 99% of the vote, unlike North Korea. It doesn't get 90% of the vote. It doesn't get 80% of the vote. In fact, it has difficulty struggling to get 70%. Now it is struggling to get 60% of the vote. Because the people in Singapore vote every 5 years. And Mr. Lee Kuan Yew wanted that because he wanted to give the people a chance to say, are you happy or not happy with the government? And over time, the People's Action Party, the ruling party, has progressively been losing seats in the parliament. And now you do have a reasonably strong opposition party in Singapore, called the Workers' Party. And if you look at all the constituencies that were contested between Workers' Party and People's Action Party, the Workers' Party got a very large number of votes in those constituencies. So Singapore is evolving in that direction. I see, and the light came on as I just said that. So the secret of Singapore's success is that you have a group of leaders who were constantly engaged with the people. Now, if any of you want to go into politics, there is one Singapore practice I urge you all to copy. Every Singapore member of parliament, without fail, once a week, must have a meet the people session. And he or she has to spend 5 or 6 hours listening to each voter coming to tell him, why is the drain not working behind my house? Why is my daughter asking to, has to pay $10 for a copybook? All these basic questions. And the Meet the People session that the PAP has done religiously now, right, for over 60 years, is a sign of great political discipline of the party. It's a party that is always listening to the people. And by contrast, by the way, if you look at the Western democracies, if you look at UK, United Kingdom, and remember the British used to run Singapore. Recently, the chief economics correspondent of Financial Times, Martin Wolf, said in the first line of his column, he said the UK has failing politics, a failed state, and a failing economy. Just imagine that the British could run the world 100 years ago, but today they have failing politics, a failed state, and a failing economy. And so that shows you the contrast between Singapore and the UK. UK has a multi-party state. We have a one dominant party state, but we have a one dominant party state that knows what the people want and gives the people what the people want. And that's why Singapore succeeded.
Thank you very much for that. You also mentioned the importance of conviction. And clearly, during your presentation, it came out very clearly that the 3 gentlemen that you mentioned had conviction. They knew where they wanted to take the country. How did they manage to pass that on to the rest of the Singaporeans? Because you may have the conviction. How do you transmit it to other people whom you work with in order for them to pull in the same direction as you're pulling, or to follow you in the direction you're going? How did that happen?
Yeah, I must say that's an excellent question. And I think the simple answer is that all the people who work directly for Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee and Rajaratnam were completely inspired by them. And so I can tell you that when you work with these 3 individuals, you get so inspired by them, you end up trying to emulate them. And I can tell you that, Lee Kuan Yew, when I was working in the Singapore Civil Service, in the Singapore Diplomatic Service, was 25 years older than me. So, much older man. But the amount of energy he had when he worked. So when I was permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I would often get messages from him, not at 9 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Quite often the messages would come at 11 p.m. at night, sometimes at midnight. And often he would expect a response within an hour. And in weekends, right, you will get messages from him. what's happening here? Why is this crisis? And you have to reply within an hour or two. So the standards they set were very high, right? He would work all the time. He never rested, you know. So people around him had said, I'm going to work twice as hard as him, right? So that kind of commitment that they had to doing things. And of course, it's not just about their work ethic. It's also about their honesty, right? The fact that they were so frugal and careful about spending money. And so in Singapore, for example, you have very strict rules about accepting gifts. The minister who accepts gifts goes to jail. By contrast, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaram, and the rest were very brutally honest, you know. So I can tell you once, after I met the richest man in Asia, Mr. Lee Ka-shing, and he had just agreed to give me $100 million for the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and I was very happy. When I was leaving his office, he suddenly gave me a Mont Blanc pen, Mont Blanc, expensive pen, and I felt terrible inside me. I had to accept the gift because he gave me a gift. But when I went back, I had to declare it. And once I declare it, the Singapore government says, if you want to keep it, you got to pay $500 for the pen. I don't need a Mont Blanc pen. So I thought, should I pay $500 for this pen? I said, no, let me pay for the pen just in case Lee Ka-shing visits me in Singapore. I want him to show him I kept his gift. And sure enough, a few months later, Lee Ka-shing came to my office. So I happily showed him, say, see, thank you for this lovely pen. I didn't tell Mr. Lee Ka-shing, I had to pay $500 for your gift. But that's a true story. And so that's an example of how the DNA of these leaders gets passed on, because we know these are the rules, this is what we have to obey. And now it's so deeply entrenched in Singapore, it's amazing. That's what's stunning. Because all three of them have passed away. But their values that they have injected into the DNA of Singapore are still powerful.
Thank you. I came to Rwanda 25 years ago. I am Ugandan, but I've lived here for a very long time. I still come and go, but I spend lots of time here. And there are many ways, well, not many perhaps, but there are ways in which Rwanda and Singapore resemble each other, at least in terms of leadership. One of the questions that I confront almost everywhere I go, if I speak about Rwanda, is continuity. They say, Rwanda is succeeding because of Kagame. What will happen when he goes? And I think that these statements used to be made about Singapore and the former President Lee Kuan Yew. How did you achieve the kind of continuity that we have seen? What happened? How did you prepare for it? Because, people would have expected that after his passing, so many disruptions would have come in because the disciplinarian is gone. How did you manage that?
Well, for a start, let me emphasize that I'm a great admirer of President Paul Kagame. And I'll tell you why. In all honesty, he started off taking care of a country that was in much worse shape than Singapore. We didn't experience a genocide. You did. So, frankly, the job given to President Paul Kagame was far more difficult than the job given to the leaders of Singapore. So I would say that for a start, what he has done in terms of taking a country that was so badly broken in the way that it was after the genocide and to restore it in the way that he has is a remarkable story in its own right that the world needs to know more about. But since I told you the story about how Singapore passed on the DNA of its founding leaders into the body politic of Singapore, I'm confident the same can be done here. in Rwanda also. Because people get inspired by leaders with conviction who are trying to do the right thing in terms of improving the livelihood of their people. And that's what inspires people to keep on going. And I can tell you, in the case of Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Rajaratnam, all the people who work with them, many of them are alive like me. I had the good fortune, which is unusual, of having worked with all three, which is unusual. But having worked with all three, I can tell you that many of the people who work with them still remember till today. They can tell you great stories about how it was like to work with the three leaders. And by the way, the hardest leader to work with was Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Because if you did a task badly, Lee Kuan Yew could give you the most brutal scolding ever. No man could scold as brutally as Lee Kuan Yew did. After you left his office, if you arrived in his office, you were 5'5". When you left, you were 1'5". He would cut you down so brutally. But today, I have been scolded by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew at least 3 or 4 times. Okay, I can tell you. All of us who were scolded by Lee Kuan Yew now wear it as a badge of honor and say, I was scolded by Lee Kuan Yew. Because really, it was so brutal, you remember it for the rest of your lives. But that was a result of the high standards that he set. So when you have a leader who sets high standards, the high standards carry on even after they leave.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now I'm going to ask you a question about something that you normally say or things that you have written about. You're very critical of, may I call it, Western advocacy for democracy and human rights. I stand to be corrected if this is not true, but I see you as being rather dismissive of that advocacy, and saying, look, this is all wrong-headed. You can't you can't attain these things superficially or artificially. They have to be attained through a process. Now, we Africans tend to be rather obsessed with this idea of democracy. We want competition, we want democratic governments, we want respect for human rights. And if somebody reads about Singapore historically, am I right in thinking or in saying that Lee Kuan Yew was rather disdainful of this advocacy regarding these two things? And if that's true, what advice would you give to Africans? Africans who want to live in democracies, liberal democracies, where there's competition among many parties, where human rights advocacy is put at the forefront. What can we learn from Singapore regarding these things?
Well, I mean, for a start, I must emphasize that for those of you who know, I didn't study, Asian philosophy. I didn't study Asian history. Most of my studies were about the West. And in fact, I studied Western philosophy. So I can tell you that I genuinely admire the Western ideals of democracy and human rights. And I would rather live in a society which respected and democracy and human rights than in a society that didn't respect them. So I always tell my friends that I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't want to live in a society where someone can come along at night, take me away and pull the nails from my hand. I don't want that to happen to me. So I want to have the protections of human rights. So why have I been so critical about the Western advocacy of democracy and human rights? And you're absolutely right. I have been very critical of them. And the simple reason why... Is this better? Is that too loud or... It's okay? Yeah. The simple reason why I have been very critical of Western advocates of democracy and human rights is that they are completely hypocritical in their advocacy of democracy and human rights, you know. And one of the principles of justice, as you know, you would not respect any judge who sentenced a poor man to death for murder, but freed a rich man who committed murder. You say that's not justice. The principle of what we call universal, the word is universalizability, is very critical. So if you apply a rule to one, you must apply it to everybody equally. But the West was hypocritical. It only preached democracy. It only complained about violations of human rights when their enemies were violating human rights. Hello? Switch off the mic at the back.
Yes.
We can just pass the mic. It's easier. Yeah. Let's just have one mic. Yeah. Then. Okay, switch it off. Just switch it off. We just use one mic. That way, there's no resonance. Yeah. So I give you a concrete example. The European countries used to complain about torture in third world countries consistently, right? And so you thought the European countries are very brave. They criticize countries when they carry out torture. But so when the United States became the first modern developed country to reintroduce torture in Guantanamo, I thought the Europeans would say, hey, we are against torture. We are against torture when poor third world countries do it. We are against torture when rich countries like United States does it. So I expected the European governments to criticize the United States for reintroducing torture. Now, I can tell you, there are at least 27, 28 European governments. Now, tell me how many European governments criticize the United States for reintroducing torture? How many? You want to know the answer? It's 0. So the Europeans are absolute cowards and hypocrites. I'm serious. I'm not exaggerating. So if you ask me why I'm so critical of the Europeans, if anybody is a coward and hypocrite, why shouldn't you expose them? Right? And what is strange about the Europeans, and this I say this as a friend of the Europeans, is that they're so naturally condescending when they speak to the rest of the world. And I ask myself, who gave you this authority to be so condescending? Right? And I've been given the good blessing of being able to respond to the Europeans. So whatever condescension the Europeans send to me, I mail it back to them double. And so, but they find it a very unusual experience because Europeans are not used to people telling them to their face the truths that they don't want to hear, right? And I say this, by the way, as a friend of Europe, because what is strange about, when I grew up in a world where the Europeans could run the world. I grew up in a British colony. If you read my memoirs, I'll tell you in my memoirs, I confess that as a child growing up in a British colony in Singapore, in my brain was programmed, and I believe that as an Asian, I was mentally, culturally, intellectually inferior to a white man. A white man, by definition, is smarter than me. I'm not white, so I'm inferior. It took me a long time to shed that sense of cultural inferiority. Because, partly because I succeeded in school and all that. I studied Western philosophy and all that. But having traveled that journey, it's amazing today that the countries that are lost today are precisely the Western countries who could run the world 100 years ago and who could condescend to the rest of the world. But today, Europe and UK are really in bad shape. So, and I'm in some ways trying to help them by saying the reason why you're in so much trouble is because you're not being honest with yourself about what you are doing. And I am just giving them some good, honest advice. And the best advice is always you must make it painful a little bit.
Yeah, just the last question, very, very briefly, and this probably will be a little bit autobiographical. The Lee Kuan Yew School teaches public policy from an Asian perspective. What does that mean? And what would teaching public policy to our students here from the African perspective mean in the light of what drove you to establish a school teaching public policy from that particular perspective? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I must emphasize that I did tell the students of the Lee Kuan Yew School that while we tried to give an Asian perspective, some of the principles of good governance and good public policy making are universal. And they're neither Western nor Eastern, even though they may have started from the West. So, for example, if you look at my book, The New Asian Hemisphere, which I published in 2008, I said, why are Asian countries succeeding now? And I said the Asian countries are succeeding because finally, after waiting 100 years or more, the Asian countries finally absorbed, understood, and implemented 7 pillars of Western wisdom. So the Asian countries are succeeding not just because of old Asian wisdom, but also by stealing Western wisdom and applying it to Asia. So I give you 2 examples which explain why Asia today is doing so much better than the West in many areas. One is free market economics, right? And it's actually quite amazing that the United States, which taught the world the virtues of free market economics, is now not signing free trade agreements. By contrast, the world's largest free trade agreement is Western concept. The world's largest free trade agreement is in Asia. It's called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It includes the 10 ASEAN countries, plus China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. So you can see the Asians are saying, no, we'll keep this. So even though the United States has walked away from free trade agreements, Asians are not. They're moving full steam ahead with free trade agreements. The second pool of Western wisdom that we learn from is science and technology, mastery of science and technology. How is it 100 years ago, 100,000 Englishmen could rule over 300 million Indians? Isn't that amazing? Shocking, right? But today, if 100,000 Englishmen go to India, they'll be massacred. Right? Massacred. So things have changed, right? And what's the difference? The mastery of science and technology is also now shifting to Asia. And I can tell you that what China has done in this area is mind-boggling. In area after today, if you go to the tier 1 peer-reviewed scientific journals, China publishes more articles than the United States of America. And if you rank universities in the world by their ability to drew research, leading research in science and technology, you find Chinese universities ahead of most American universities nowadays. So this is amazing. So in response to your question, we don't believe that we can just teach Asian wisdom. We have to learn best practices from all over the world, and not just from Asia or the West. Anywhere, if we can find a better answer somewhere, we will go and find it. So hopefully, if we teach them meritocracy, pragmatism, honesty, one of the rules of pragmatism is that you must be prepared to learn from any place in the world. And so the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy doesn't look at the country of origin of a good policy. If it's a good policy, even if it came Africa or Europe or United States or Japan, we'll take it. And hopefully that spirit of openness is what will keep the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and in general all the Asian schools to continue to grow and thrive. And that's why I'm confident that the African School of Governance can do very well, because in many ways, the path has already been cleared. So, and that's what Singapore learned. Other countries have solved problems, we copy them. And anybody else can do, therefore, what we have done. So I'm confident that ASG can do it too.
Okay, so now I would like to open up. I would like to open the discussion to the floor. Questions, comments. As Professor Feni said, one question, one comment. Yeah, the gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Robert Ganzamari. I have a question. I am from Rwanda. In the context where international organizations and NGOs attract top professionals in Africa by offering relatively higher salaries, how can African countries best recruit and retain top talent on the basis of merit to strengthen their economies and public administration? And what would you tell us, the students, who will soon be these talents in that regard?
You're right. It's a big challenge. I mean, if you're graduating from today as a young person, in many Asian countries too, not just in Africa, international organization salaries are much higher, and most governments pay much lower salaries. So it is difficult. But it is possible still for governments to attract, not all, some talented people, if you can explain to them that the work that they do will make a difference to many more lives. So when you work in a government agency and you implement the right policies, the number of people who benefit from your policies is amazing, right? So in terms of doing good, you can do far more good if you work for a government agency than you can for many international organizations, International organizations are more comfortable. You can get a lifetime salary, a lifetime pension, and so on and so forth, which you can't get. So I would say that it is definitely a struggle, but we found in the early years of Singapore, our salaries were very low. In fact, the first thing that Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam did after they took power in 1965, when they became independent, the first thing they did was to cut civil service salaries, which were already low. Why did they cut? Singapore government had no money to pay for them. But fortunately, Singapore succeeded. And now, as you know, I don't know how many of you know this, the country that pays the highest civil service salaries in the world is Singapore. But we went from a country that cut civil service salaries to a country with the highest civil service salaries by getting people who were dedicated to improving their society. So that's the answer. You must give people the motivation to work in an environment where the salary will be much less, but the fulfillment will be much stronger.
Thank you very much, Professor Kishori. My name is Timothy Awuzie. I am a Nigerian, where we have over 300 ethnic groups. My question is, given Africa's diverse ethnic and cultural landscape, how can leaders maintain strong conviction in driving bold policy reforms while fostering inclusive governance that builds trust across communities? Thank you.
Yeah, a good question. One of the, again, unknown aspects about Singapore is that Singapore is actually quite a diverse country. So 75% of the population is Chinese, 15% is Malay Muslim, and about 6% are Indians. I'm ethnically Indian. So I belong to a minority in Singapore. But actually I belong to a minority within a minority, because most of the Indians in Singapore are from South India. My family came from North India. So North Indians are a minority within a minority in Singapore. And as you know, the British left behind when British colonial rule ended. They left behind multi-ethnic societies, like Singapore, in every corner of the world. They left in South America, it was Guyana. In Europe, it was Cyprus. In South Asia, it was Sri Lanka. In Southeast Asia, it was Singapore. In the Pacific, it was Fiji. Out of these 5, only 1 out of the 5 has experienced ethnic harmony. That's Singapore. Why? Because in Singapore, the leaders decided there'd be no racial discrimination at all. So meritocracy meant that the government didn't care whether you were Chinese, Malay, or Indian. If you were good, you rose. So it was ethnic colorblind. And secondly, the reason why Sri Lanka had a brutal war for 20 years is because the Sri Lankan government made a mistake and only allowed one official language, which is the language of the majority, and the language of the minority, the Tamils, was suppressed. That 20 years of war. In Singapore, the Tamils make up 6% of the population, or less. But Tamil is one of the 4 official languages of Singapore. So when Singaporeans get income tax forms, they get it in English, in Chinese, in Malay, in Tamil. So by respecting all the languages, we ensured that no one was discriminated against. So I would say Singapore's example of delivering racial and religious harmony is one of the best examples in the world. Because as you know, again, I'm sorry to criticize the West. Today in the West, there's a huge backlash against migrants. And the far-right parties are coming into power. And what are the far-right parties demanding? Suppress the minorities. In Singapore, we don't suppress the minorities. In fact, in my case, I can tell you the first time when I went out as a diplomat representing Singapore, I met a German lady in Cambodia, our chargé d'affaires, and I said, I'm the chargé d'affaires of Singapore. This German lady looked at me, she says, you cannot be. I said, why can't I be? She said, Singapore is Chinese. You're not Chinese, how can you be a chargé d'affaires? I said, no, in Singapore, we don't believe in ethnic policies, and we are all equal. So so I would say, that in response to your question, respect every different ethnic group, cultural group, and treat them equally and discriminate against none.
Thank you so much. I'm Diana, and in sharing Singapore's story, you told us how hardships are core to sharpening some of the greatest leaders. And my question is, do you think that younger generations who might not have faced these significant hardships could become great transformative leaders? And if so, what are some of the core traits that you think they might have to cultivate to be able to solve some of the problems that they themselves might not have experienced? Thank you so much.
Well, I can tell you, I feel your pain. She's been deprived of hardship. If you read my memoirs, you find that till today I believe that if I hadn't been born poor, if I hadn't had the challenges I had in my childhood, I wouldn't be where I am today in some ways. It was the challenge really made a difference to me, you know. But I would say that I mean, you're fortunate not to have experienced that kind of hardship, but I think it's important to also, we all have just one life, okay? Let's be very clear. The most precious thing we have is our lives. We only have one life. And you can either spend it, you know, just being frivolous and doing whatever you want to do, having fun all the time, or you can try and do it, use it meaningfully and try to make a difference and create a better world that helps other people. And I've always found in my life that the people who try to help other people to improve themselves are the people who lead the most fulfilling lives. They're not just focused on themselves. They're focused on trying to help others. And that's why I emphasize that Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Rajaratnam, the most important quality they had was compassion. And the three of them came from reasonably comfortable families. None of the three were poor like me. In fact, they had a reasonably middle class, or lower middle class upbringing. They could have led comfortable lives. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew could have made millions as a lawyer. Dr. Goh Keng Swee could have made millions as a banker. And Rajaratnam could have made millions, you know, in the field of communication. So they gave up all the attractive careers to focus on trying to improve the livelihoods of the Singaporeans. They were committed to doing that. So I would say my advice to young people is find a vocation where you will make a difference to creating a better world, and you'll find that you'll have a much richer life as a result.
Yeah, and with that, unfortunately, we have to close. Professor Mabubani, I'm sure others will agree with me that we could have probably gone another 2 hours just listening to you. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So by popular demand, we'll continue.
Thank you. You can go on to 5, is that okay? Yeah. I'm flexible.
Thank you so much, Professor Kishore. My name is Kevin Kalo, and I'm from Uganda. My question is, apart from being frugal, what other policies did Dr. Goh Keng Swee come up with that made Singapore move from a poor nation to a rich nation? Thank you.
Apart from what?
Apart from being frugal, because you said he was
frugal.
very frugal. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, the first and most important contribution he made was in the Ministry of Finance, because he developed the institutions to manage Singapore's money, including setting up Singapore Central Bank, which is, you know, very critical, as you know, in any country. He also set up our sovereign wealth fund, right? That's already big enough deals. But in addition to being Minister of Finance, he was also Minister of Defense. And I can tell you that Singapore's armed forces today are among the best in the world. We have never fought a war. Never. But everyone knows that Singapore has got amazing capabilities. And one of the policies he introduced that made a huge difference to Singapore was national service. So soon after independence, 3-4 years after independence, every young person in Singapore had to spend 2 years, 2 months in national military service. And that created, as a result, a strong reserve of soldiers that Singapore has, right? Our military, which is among one of the best in the world, is a gift of Dr. Goh Keng Swee. But in addition to that, Dr. Goh Keng Swee was responsible for the industrial development of Singapore. And when Singapore became independent, it had no industries. But we had a lot of vacant land then. And there was a piece of swamp called Jurong. Now, without any commitments from anybody, he decided on his own to fill the swamp with land, to stabilize the land for industries. And when he created this big vacant land for industrial park, it was known as Dr. Goh's folly. That Dr. Goh made a mistake by creating all this land, but no industries. And you know what? Within a few years, the industries came. And that's how Jurong Industrial became one of the most successful industrial places in the world. Again, a gift from Dr. Goh Keng Swee. And in addition to all these big things, he also understood that for a country to succeed, you cannot just pay attention to the hard material side of things. You got to pay attention to the soft side. So he set up the first bird park. He set up the first zoo in Singapore. He set up the first night zoo in the world. He set up the Singapore Symphony Orchestra. He set up an Institute of East Asian Philosophy. Dr. Goh was a Renaissance man. He could do things from the whole range, from money to defense, to industry, to symphony orchestras, to animals and zoos. He was a remarkable human being. So what I've given you is just a tiny glimpse of how brilliant and amazing these men were.
Thank you, Prof. As African, I've listened to...
Sorry?
As an African, I've listened to the narration and development of Singapore and Asia in general, but I'm worried about how to apply it in Africa, considering some of the cultural differences. I want to give an example. Africa are more communal. Communal in religion, communal in tribe, communal in ethnicity. So how do you manage meritocracy with communism? Given the fact that name and shame in Africa is part of our growth. If you are given responsibility, they want to see you back home, what you bring back home. So it's really affecting how to balance merit with nepotism, so to say. There's what we call copy-paste in Africa. Character commission, for example. Character commission introduced to bring everybody, inclusivity, all tribe, all religion should be on board in organization.
Sorry,
in government.
what commission is this?
Character commission. Character. For example, in Nigeria, we call Federal Character Commission. It's an agency of the government meant to balance equal representation. Okay? So when you copy this to breed inclusivity, what happened to the merit? And how do we gain from the experience of Singapore to make this work in African countries?
So if I understood your question, you're talking about the great diversity in Africa. And how do you create cooperation despite great diversity, right? And the differences. But you'll be surprised to learn that the diversity in Africa cannot match the diversity in Southeast Asia. Cannot. You know why? There are 700 million people living in Southeast Asia. That includes 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists. We include Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, and we have a lot of communists too. Africa cannot match Southeast Asia. And despite the fact that Southeast Asia is the most diverse region on planet Earth by far, today it has the world's most successful regional organization, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. The Western media rubbishes ASEAN every day. But you know, if you had asked me 10 years ago or 15 years ago, which will break up first, ASEAN or EU? Everybody would say ASEAN, right? Guess what? The EU broke up. Brexit. So ASEAN is more resilient than EU. And I tell my European friends, I say, the trouble with you Europeans is that you're so legalistic. Everything is going to be done. You see, the Europeans, when they created the European Union, they had a treaty, a very elaborate treaty, the Treaty of Rome. When ASEAN was created, we had a 2-page declaration. That's all. And so I said, if we had a problem like UK in ASEAN, we would have told the British, why don't you take a vacation? Leave EU for 5 years, try it out. If you like it, stay out. If you don't like it, come back. It's a simple, pragmatic solution, right? But the European mind can't do it because it's legalistic. By contrast, ASEAN is the most pragmatic regional organization in the world. We are very flexible. So if 10 of us cannot cooperate, we say, okay, let's adopt the ASEAN minus X principle. All 10 cannot cooperate, 6 go first. The 4 will wait behind, see how the 6 do. If they do well, okay, maybe you join them. They do badly, goodbye. So, you know, the culture of flexibility and pragmatism that we have developed in Southeast Asia is something that I think Africa should study. You see, and I can tell you this, please forgive me for this. When you have to choose a name for African Union, you tried to copy the European Union. You should have instead copied ASEAN and call yourself Association of African States. That will be much more flexible and much more easygoing. And then countries can take a vacation and come back.
So we're going to take one last question, and then that will be the end of it. You want to just go? No. Not you. Not you.
Thank you. My name is Patricia Ikuret from Uganda. From the discussion, I note that effective public policies move hand in hand with great leadership. So my question is, how do the changes in regime impact policy continuity and innovation?
How do we continue policy innovation?
Yes. The changes in leadership, like how do they impact the changes in leadership, like when governments change, how does this impact policy continuation and innovation?
Well, in theory, when you have changes in leadership, you can have disruptions. That's a fact. And in most countries, when leadership changes, there are disruptions, right? And quite often countries go, you know, I mean, take the United States as an example, right? It's hard to believe that the one country, the same people, can in the years 2000, 2009 to 2016, elect Barack Obama, and then 2017, elect Donald Trump. I mean, what have Barack Obama and Donald Trump got in common? Nothing. Have zero. And yet the same country elected this thing. So that's a challenge, obviously. But not all countries are like the United States. In most countries in the world, I've observed, there's a greater degree of continuity in the leadership and in the norms that have been bred in the country. So in the case like Singapore, for example, the norms and values have become so entrenched now that even though we now have a very young prime minister in Singapore, by the way, Lawrence Wong, he's about 50 years old, I think, very young. And I think was born at Singapore's independence or something like that. After Singapore. He was born after Singapore's independence, yeah. But despite that, the values of his government are clearly those of previous Singapore governments because they've been injected into the DNA of Singapore. So my answer to your question is that society should make an effort to decide which are the important values they have for their society. And societies may have different values, by the way. I must emphasize that. So whatever values are important for the society, try to entrench them as much as possible so that even when leaders come and go, the values don't come and go. So I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Mabubani. I think with that, we now have to close. Hopefully, Professor, you'll be coming back again and again, because I'm sure. And now I'm going to hand over to the moderator of the event to tell us what happens next.
Thank you very much for this wonderful session. Thank you very much for this wonderful session. I believe we would have been here the whole night if we had a chance, but unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. So before we close, we'll ask Mr. Gitari to give us our closing remarks. I'm done? Okay, all right. So thank you very much, our distinguished guests. I also want to acknowledge Anne, the wife of Prof. Kishori, who is hiding at the back. Thank you. Thank you so much for everything, for enjoying this session. It didn't start on time, but you've been very gracious. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is groundbreaking because this is the first policy dialogue for ASG. And can you imagine how it started? It's going to be better as the days go by. So thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. And with that, we wrap up.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. We do have a registry outside. Please just fill in your details. We would have a lot of these monthly, so it's important to have a network of people to invite to this event. And also feel free to suggest to us topics. But I would like to also take the time to thank Professor Kishore for coming to spend time with us, Mr. Gatare for helping us with this, and also the Vice President of Academic Affairs and my colleagues for making this possible. Thank you. There's some refreshment outside also. So as you network, please avail yourself some of the refreshments we have there. The session is now closed. Thank you. We can go. And to those online, thank you for coming online. This event was live streamed in case you find yourself online. Just know it was live streamed. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.